Okay, so our next lesson is all about estimation of population proportion. So what's the concept behind estimation of population proportion? First, let's try to define what is a proportion. Proportion, the ratio of the number of units possessing a characteristic to the total number of units in the population, is a population proportion. Again, when we say population proportion, the ratio of the number of units possessing a characteristic to the total number of units in the population, we call it population proportion. For example, proportion of learners who passed the last quiz in Math 02. Proportion of Filipinos who live in poverty. Proportion of housing units in the Philippines with roof made of strong materials. Proportion of piatos, chips that are not broken. So a proportion can be expressed as fractions, decimals, or percentage. Can also present probabilities. Okay, so when we say proportion, a ratio of number of units possessing to the total number of units in the population. Okay, can be obtained from sample or a population. So notation for proportion, so P, okay, P symbol is referring to the population proportion. P hat, you're referring to sample proportion. Okay, P, population proportion, P hat, sample proportion. Okay, for a sample proportion, so to solve for a sample proportion, that will be X over N, and then Q hat, that will be N minus X over N, or another formula is that 1 minus P hat. Okay, when we say X, a number of sample units that possesses a characteristic of interest, and N, you're referring to the sample size. So for example, in a recent survey of 150 households, 54 had central air conditioning. So find the P hat and then Q hat, where P hat is the proportion of the household that have central air conditioning. Okay, so in that particular example, we need to look for the P hat. Remember, when we say P hat, that will be X over N. When we say X, you're referring to the number of units. Okay, so in this particular problem, there are 54 had central air conditioning. Out of how many household? There are 150 household. So therefore, your sample proportion is 0.36, or that will be 36%. And then your Q hat, that will be 1 minus P hat. So that will be 1 minus 0.36, that will be 0.64, or simply 64%. Okay? So a point estimate of the population proportion is the sample proportion. So basically, when we say the best point estimator of the population is a sample. So since we're talking about population proportion, so basically the best point estimator of the population proportion is the sample proportion. Okay, generally when we say the best point estimator of the population is always a sample. So since in this particular topic we're talking about proportion, population proportion, so the best point estimator of the population proportion is the sample proportion. Okay, for the standard error, or another term for that is the standard deviation of the sample proportion. Okay, the standard error, another term for that is the standard deviation of sample proportion, since we're talking about proportion. So that will be equal to the square root of p hat, which is your sample proportion, multiplied by 1 minus p hat over n. So that's your standard error, or your standard deviation of the sample proportion. Okay? With a sufficient sample size n, the sampling distribution of the sample proportion could be approximated by the standard normal distribution based on central limit theorem. Because since we're talking about central limit theorem, again, people, you're talking about sample. Okay? Sample. So for example, let's try example number 1. A survey is conducted to determine the opinions of people on global warming. Okay. In a random sample of 150 people, 108 think that global warming is a serious world problem. So number 1, in the first example, estimate the proportion of adults who think that the global warming is serious world problem. Number 2, what is the standard error of this estimate? So number 1, estimate the proportion, okay, of adults who think that the global warming is a serious world problem. We're talking about the best point estimate, or the best point estimator of the population proportion, which is the best point estimator, or the best point estimate of the population proportion is the sample proportion. So to answer number 1, which is estimate the proportion, we need to apply the sample proportion, which is p hat. Okay, sample proportion denoted by this symbol, p hat, is equal to x over n. When we say x, you're referring to the sample units. Okay, sample units. In this particular example, your random sample is 150. So that is your m. Your sample size is 150. In 150, there are 108 think that the global warming is serious. So meaning, your x will be 108. Okay? 108. So therefore, your sample proportion is 0.72. 0.72, or that will be equivalent to 72%. Okay? Next, number 2. What is the standard error of this estimate? When we say standard error, you're referring to the standard deviation of the sample proportion. So the standard error, or the another term for that is the standard deviation of the sample proportion, that will be equal to the square root of p hat multiplied by 1 minus p hat over n. So your p hat is 0.72 multiplied by 1 minus p hat, so there, that will be 1 minus 0.72, which is 0.28 over 150. So your standard error, or your standard deviation of a sample proportion, is 0.0367. Okay, or 2 decimal places, that will be 0.04, which is equal to 4%. Okay, 4%, or that will be 0.04. This one.